I just wanted to say a couple of words of introduction to the people that are hosting this conference on the UCL side today. One, to introduce a new entity, the School for the Creative and Cultural Industries, which I'm the inaugural director of, which is a new kind of way of connecting shared interests in media, history and heritage and creative practice across all of UCL, but really focused on the faculties of Arts and Humanities and Social Sciences and the Institute of Education. We're based in a whole set of really exciting new facilities at UCL East, which will be launching formally in a couple of weeks, and I warmly invite you all to come and see what we're doing when the buildings are fully open. We hope that through a whole host of new teaching programs, we'll be training the next generation of both cultural producers and also critically engaged audiences. And we're really excited also to think about how, through our research and sharing of facilities, we can develop new relationships with the sector, both as collaborators and participants in projects and shared projects, but also, I think, really mindful of the state of funding at the moment, how we might, in the university, share our facilities and be a resource for the sector as well. We're very much poised at the beginning of this adventure, and I'm very much in listening mode today and looking forward to hearing from the panels that are coming about how we might support better. I also want to tell you a little bit about UCL's Innovation and Enterprise, who are supporting and have been organising so well the conference today. Innovation and Enterprise works with UCL staff and students and businesses of all shapes and size, governments, NGOs and the third sector, to create partnerships, to give academics access to funding, to commercialise UCL technology, to assist consultancy and so on. They look after the strategic relationship between the university and Acme and Res Artis, and have done a tremendous amount of work in organising this conference. And I'd particularly like to thank James Jennings and Rebecca Robinson for their work today. James and Rebecca are both here, as well as Michael Rainier, the Interim Director of Business and Innovation Partnerships. If you're interested in finding out more about Innovation and Enterprise, please seek them out, and please feel free to come and talk to me about the School for the Creative and Cultural Industries. I'll also mention now that there will be a drinks reception at the end of the day, and I'll tell you more about that later. Great, I think can I click? Yes. So let's move on to the next session, which is called State of Play, Artists and Residencies. The discussion is going to be facilitated by Leo Laughlin, from the co-director of Acme, and we'll be bringing Julie Lomax, the Chief Executive Officer of AN, the Artists Information Company, and Josephine Mead, Communication and Programme Coordinator at Res Artis Australia, into dialogue with one another. If I can invite the panel to come to the stage.
Good morning. It's very bright up here, so it's very dark out there. So I'm joined by Julie and Josephine, and the way that this session is going to run is Julie is going to talk particularly about an incredibly important recent report that AN have been involved with, and then that will be followed by Josephine and the work that Res Artis and UCL have been doing in terms of looking at the residencies sector and the impact of COVID-19 on the residency sector as well, after which I'll facilitate a little bit of a conversation about those two actors that we have that always need to work together collaboratively, artists and residency providers. So I'll hand over to Julie.
Hi, thanks, Leah. I'm just going to make sure I've got this right. Yes. Oh. Hi, so my name's Julie Lomax, and I have worked at AN now for 5 years. And one of the strands of work that we do is research. And mainly the research that we look at is on the impact of livelihoods of artists. And so much of our work is grouped around that, and our advocacy work, and also any work that we do in terms of informing artists about fair pay, contracts, etc. So I'm going to talk today about a report that actually came to us as a partnership. And I found Industria actually on Instagram. And I think it was just around the kind of post-lockdown period. And so probably had a lot more time to be scrolling on Instagram than I do perhaps today. And what I wanted to say ahead of this is I'm here speaking on behalf of Industria in terms of this presentation, and they will be paid for their time, because what they can't do is be here because they're anonymous. And in fact, we had a conversation recently and I said they're kind of like the Banksy of, you know, the expose of artists and the fact that they don't get paid in the sector. So as you can see, the report is called structurally, I'm going to say EFT for the purposes of the recording throughout this, but I think it's pretty clear what that second word is. And it comes from one of the quotes which came through the research. I'm going to say a little bit about AN. We are the largest membership organisation for artists in the UK. I will be saying more later, so I'll skip through this quite quickly. And these are some of our events and people and members. So we are an organisation of people. We have over 31,000 members, but we actually started as a 500 copy a month newsletter in 1980. And we support our members and visual artists and the wider sector, as I said, with research and advocacy, with this focus on artists' livelihoods. So, as I said, I actually found Industria on the on their Instagram account, and I'm a real fan of grassroots activism. And I thought it was really interesting that there was this Instagram account that was calling out all of the bad practice. I've worked in the sector now for probably over 30 years in various different roles. And what it did is it was really putting a spotlight, and I felt it was very brave. And at the time, we were looking at refreshing our paying artists work. And I thought, what a great idea to actually, you know, use this grassroots activism and incorporate that in any future work that we do. And so I got in touch with them, did the usual messaging, and they were really interested. And what they did is they followed our work in terms of doing workshops with artists and looking at how we might refresh our payment guidance and developing a code of practice, etc. But as part of that, they said to me, we've got this artist leaks data that we'd really like to form into a report, but they didn't have the resources or even, infrastructure around them to do it. And so we stepped in. And so it was a real collaboration right from the start. And you know, I think if anybody's worked in any part of the sector, we know that there is a lot of the sector that isn't very fair. And there is this expectation of artists to over-deliver, which is unspoken and loud. Everybody overcommits, and as the artist, you're at the bottom of the food chain and expected to do your magic in a system that is structurally effed. So that's one of the quotes from the report. So what did we find out from the report? We found out that, you know, when artists started to calculate and look at these issues, mainly due to lump sums that they're given for commissions, that there is an overall median hourly rate of £2.60 per hour. And that's dramatically below the UK minimum wage of £10.18 an hour. When I first joined AN, I was sat in a workshop and there was an artist that was working for a gallery, and they started to describe what they were doing. And I did a quick kind of back of the envelope look at what the labour was in terms of what they were being paid. And I said, actually, you're being paid under the national minimum wage, and that's actually illegal. And it's just a really simple thing, that is the national minimum wage, and it is illegal to not pay it in this country. And so, again, we want to give artists those tools to empower them. And then when you look at the production of artworks and exhibition making, that hourly rate fell to £1.88 an hour. And, you know, it doesn't take you know, a mathematician to work out that actually, if that's what working in the sector and making commissions and making exhibitions means for an artist, it's numerically impossible for them to make a living, and B, probably physically impossible. Again, when we were looking at this work with Industria, I said, you would have to work over 900 days a year to even make a basic curatorial wage. And there isn't 900 days in a year. So it's actually physically and numerically impossible. And 76% of responses reported fees below the minimum wage. When we did some research in 2014, 71% of artists that were actually working in a publicly funded gallery and exhibiting in publicly funded spaces were not paid. And so that's really, you know, this is publicly funded institutions, organisations, galleries, museums, etc., that are not paying properly. Lump sums are a common form of payment for artists, and within that, obviously, what doesn't get looked at are the hours of labour involved in a project. And also 74 respondents stated that they felt the artist's fee received was unfair in relation to the scale of the work. And if you look at the report, there's a lot of qualitative information where people felt that it really impacted on their mental health, the way that they engaged with the organisation. And, you know, we can speculate that some of these issues are really to do with what is at the root of the DNA in the visual arts sector. So, you know, most of our, the trading that happens in the sector is about the object and not the person. And this has been going on, you know, since, you know, art was first happening, really, but particularly pulled into focus with a patronage model around the Renaissance. So if you think about this as being in the DNA for quite a long time, and it's kind of transferred into the public sector. And there was I won't name any names, but there's a very well-known and very high up curator in a major institution in London, described the way that the institution worked, and especially in relation to that public and private, is at best insider training, at worst a giant Ponzi scheme. And so, you know, if you think of a major public institution behaving like that, then of course that behaviour then moves all the way through the institution and through to artists too. And also what hasn't been taken into account, and it's part of this DNA, is this idea that actually trading the objects, there was an explosion in artistic practice, you know, in the 60s and 70s, which was non-object based, argue probably earlier than that as well. And the expansion of art schools and polytechnics. So it's a really outdated and outmoded approach to think about the object and not think about the person. So, recommendations. So there are recommendations for both institutions, but also recommendations for artists. So the recommendations for institutions in the report. So I really like the idea of, you know, not to critique, you know, critique without solution is, you know, where does that go? So these are really great, I think, recommendations. So institutions and commissioners need to publicly make the case for increased funding. The reason that it is structurally F for artist is actually there is structural inequity in funding for the visual arts sector in this country, in the UK. And I'm not going to go into the reasons why, but believe me, I know. I worked at Arts Council England for many years, and I can do the comparison across the different art forms. Commissioners must commit immediately to at least the minimum wage and work towards an artist's and freelancers' living wage, which is a really, could be a very simple thing to do. For artists, join a union, but also join AN. We have very different functions, and I know that you heard from Zita yesterday, but very important. So we give artists the tools to be able to work, and then a union will come in and actually represent you if there is a dispute or if there are issues in the workplace. And we stand side by side with the Scottish Artists Union and Artists Union England. Keep an artist's time diary, protect yourself with a contract. And this one is very interesting, stop performing for success and working for free, and keep speaking about bad experiences. And that's really important, because everybody says, oh, it's very difficult to do that. But actually, if you think about the Screenwriters Guild of America, they're a very, very powerful lobby, and they're all freelance. And this is a slide of Kevin Hunt's arm, which says, how do you want to employ me? And there's a really brilliant resource on the web, which is where he documented all the different offers that he had over a year, and whether they were, being asked to work for free, whether there was a contract involved, etc. And when I look at that, and I look at the administration that an artist has to go through, and it fills me with dismay, really. But it is a good resource, and it gives you a real picture about how artists have to work. And that's a range of things, from exhibition, technical work, residencies, etc. So obviously, if we don't pay artists, we're going to have a very homogenous art world. And this is a quote from Yinka Shonabare: we won't have great artists making significant work in years to come if we don't tackle the problem of low to no pay. And one of the things that I really like about the report is it shows us how to take collective responsibility, and collective responsibility is a really powerful action. It also looks at new economies of exchange, and that are artist-centred, transparent, about fair pay, and also care and respect. I'm an employer, I work with a team, and it would be absolutely inconceivable for me to not be transparent with my team, treat them fairly, make sure they were properly paid for the work that they do, and that I have respect and care for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. That was really insightful. I think there's a lot that we'll talk through after Josephine's presentation as well. But I'm particularly taken in the context of this conference and the last few days that we've been having our discussions and our workshops around that notion of not critiquing without solution. And I think that pragmatic approaches is certainly something over the last 2 days that I know residency providers have been very focused on. So I'm looking forward to picking that up in our conversation. For now, I will pass over to Josephine Mead to look at actually organisationally those residency provider situation.
Hi everyone, thanks Lee and thanks Julie for that wonderful presentation. So as mentioned, I'm the Communication and Program Coordinator at Res Artis. For anyone online with vision impairment, I'm a white woman with brown hair, bright lipstick and bright earrings. So I'm part-time at Res Artis and I operate from our international headquarters on Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, Australia. When I'm not there, I'm an artist, writer and curator, and I've undertaken several residencies with some of our wonderful members and with external providers. So it's from those two privileged vantage points that I'll be speaking today. So I have been at Res Artis for a year and a half after the first two COVID impact survey reports were produced, and I'll be working to deliver the third shortly. So I apologise in advance because my presentation is full of statistics, but I think it's worth noting that I was one of those statistics. I'd commenced a residency with one of our members, Zentrum für Kunst und Urbanistik in Berlin. It was a planned 6 months residency, but I came home early after 2 months in early 2020 when the pandemic began to spike and borders began to close. So as COVID-19 ramifications began to be felt around the globe in early 2020, the global arts residency field, which relies on international exchange and in-person collaboration, was hit hard. Res Artis was confronted with stories of stranded artists, members needing to close programs and sell furniture to survive, and members and artists struggling with the challenges of postponing and cancelling residencies, and the obstacles of a field that needed to shift to digital exchange to stay afloat. The main threats to the field were travel restrictions, financial hits and public health measures. And Res Artis needed to consider how we could best support artists and residency providers and work towards the sustainability of our sector. We believe that we were best placed to do this through providing digital resources, such as advice for online working models and on residency agreements, cancellations and postponements, and through collecting data to work towards a sustainable future for the field. So our ability to collect data came through a collaboration with University College London to produce 3 surveys examining the impact of COVID-19 on the field. We wanted to document effects on artist mobility, articulating the challenges and opportunities for the sector. We hope the collaboration will lead to a positive change for the sector as a whole, providing information, support and policy recommendations for artists, host organisations and funding bodies. We've completed 2 surveys, Survey 1 in September 2020 to consider the immediate impacts, Survey 2 in March 21 to consider medium-term impacts, and we will shortly be producing Survey number 3. Results from Survey 1 were reported in 2020. We had 1,132 responses to the survey, 774 respondents identified as artists, and 358 identified as arts organisations. And the survey considered how the outbreak of COVID-19 affected in-progress and upcoming residencies, how artists and organisations were being impacted, and considered future anticipations. Respondents were from all over the globe, representing Europe, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, North and South America, Australia and New Zealand. Artist respondents came from multidisciplinary practices, 36% identified as emerging, 41% as mid-career and 23% as established. And arts organisation respondents were mostly from not-for-profit or artist-run organisations. While the results can be considered as a diverse global representation, I think it's still very important to note that internet access and social economic demands reduce the potential for residency opportunities in certain areas and limit the capacity for artists and providers to respond to surveys in some areas. We hope that we can work to widen access in the future. Survey 1 showed that more than half of respondents' planned residencies were cancelled or otherwise modified due to the pandemic. Artists and arts organisations shared a strong sentiment of uncertainty for the future. There was a lack of faith in the possibilities of online residencies and concern about how this would change the field. And when considering areas that would be greatly affected, respondents anticipated that impacts would affect 3 main areas: events and projects, professional development, and motivation and inspiration. So the financial impact. 30% of artists said that they were concerned about the ongoing personal financial implications caused by the pandemic. 12.6% were affected by non-refundable residency fees and airfares. 47% said that the cancellation of residencies had significantly or critically impacted their finances. And additional lost funding opportunities included cancelled speaking engagements, exhibitions and workshops, cancelled or delayed payments, decreased opportunities to sell work, expenses to remain on residency, non-refundable travel expenses and cancellation fees. And I think it's worth noting that artists from different fields had different levels of financial impact, with fields that rely on in-person exchange and performance hit a little bit harder. So for example, 87.5% of dancers compared to 47% of visual artists reported being significantly or critically financially impacted. We asked the respondents about their experiences with emergency funding support. 31% said that they found no relevant funding opportunities. 13% had applied for emergency support and were rejected. 12% were ineligible for emergency support, and 68% could not access emergency funding support of any kind. When asked what alternative sources of income respondents had pursued, we found that 34% found part-time work within the arts sector, 12% found full-time work within the sector, 36% found work outside of the sector, and 12% found full-time work. 36 found part-time work, and 12% found full-time work outside of the sector. And the survey indicated that a lack of funding opportunities could be connected to migration status, lack of consistent income, ageism in the arts with a lot of opportunities directed at emerging or young artists, high levels of competition, and a lack of opportunity in rural areas. Respondents called for more international aid opportunities and more transparency in how funding opportunities were promoted. Res Artis worked to produce a variety of resources to assist members to consider online residency and working opportunities, and to support artists to share and create work online. Roughly half of our respondents were in support of virtual experiences, while half felt that it was a potential harm to the sector. Respondents agree that some aspects of residencies could function virtually, such as networking, professional development, and community engagement. Most respondents felt that virtual residencies could be complementary to in-person exchange, but will never equal a replacement. And apologies, I think I went to one slide too far. We asked how arts organisations could help artists. Artists asked for residencies to be delayed instead of cancelled. They called for open and clear communication and asked for organisations to provide online opportunities. And of course, we shared these suggestions with our members. Arts organisations reported drastic effects on their programs as a result of the pandemic. They reported that 53% of activities were modified or postponed. 70% were critically or significantly impacted. 88% of events and projects were affected. 71% of organisations lost income from residency fees. 49% anticipated long-term financial consequences. And 1 in 3 said that their community interaction would be affected. Many organisations were ineligible for funding due to their lack of salaried employees, status as private foundations, and physical location. And I think the lack of salaried employees shows the degree to which the sector relies on voluntary labour and how this can raise so many issues. 1 in 10 organisations had to close indefinitely. So in March 21, we were able to report our findings from Survey 2. We received 611 responses, 441 of which were from artists and 170 from arts organisations. 42% of the respondents were our members. The decrease of responses from Survey 1 indicated a sense of survey fatigue and digital fatigue that was prevalent across the sector and elsewhere at the time. And the aim of Survey 2 was to focus on the financial state of the sector, the mental health impacts of the pandemic, and future anticipations. So of the 441 artist respondents, 27% were emerging, 47% were mid-career, and 25% were established. The main region of artists represented was from the USA, followed by the UK and then Australia. Likewise, the main region of arts organisations was from the USA, followed by Italy and then Finland. It became clear through the survey that travel restrictions and the state of the pandemic had largely deterred respondents from applying for residencies since the first survey. So when we asked respondents if they were planning to participate in a residency program that was cancelled or postponed, 42% said yes, and 42% said that they were not planning a residency in 21. 19% had a residency postponed, 18% had a residency cancelled, and 8% had a residency experience modified to accommodate the needs of the pandemic, and the remainder chose not to comment. When asked about the financial impacts of COVID-19, 28% of artists reported being impacted financially by changes and cancellations. 48% lost income from projects and 32% lost income from artwork sales. Financial support received was often not enough, with one respondent stating that the government funding is a third of what my salary was. All other grants I applied for denied my application. There was a noticeable shift of artists and arts workers needing to pursue other forms of income, with 65% of artists pursuing sources of income outside of the arts sector. When asked about accessibility to emergency funding support, 80% who received emergency support reported that they needed to use it for daily living expenses. 34% used it for the creation of new work, and amounts of funding received varied drastically. Emerging artists were most likely to receive access to emergency funding, with 73% having received funding. From survey 1, it was clear that the mental health impacts on the sector as a result of the pandemic were high and would have ongoing effects. We asked respondents to report on this, and 88% said that their mental health had been somewhat affected. 25% has been significantly impacted, and 57% reported that impacts to their mental health had affected their ability to make new work. And in survey 3, we want to consider the mental health impacts on residency providers in more detail. So 6% of arts organisations reported that they had to close indefinitely, a slight improvement from 9% in survey 1. 16% of organisations said that they did not have to change their operations, and 37% were able to resume partial operations after a temporary closure. 61% were unable to access funding, and 66% said no relevant funding was available. The majority of funding came from national sources, suggesting that there should be an increase of international funding across the sector. We're almost done with the statistics. Well done, everyone, for bearing with me. Organisations used funding predominantly to pay staff and cover operational costs, such as rent and outgoings. 25% used funding for digital innovations, indicating that the sustainability of this sector was reliant on digital infrastructure. And interestingly, the amount of funding gained through philanthropy was 1.58 times the average amount provided by governments. Through the survey, respondents still indicated a sense of optimism for the future, with artists still applying for residencies. 61% of artists were planning to attend a residency in 2021, and residencies providers expressed hope that successful vaccination programs and relaxed travel restrictions would allow them to rebuild their programs. 71% of arts organisations planned in-person residencies for 2021. When asked again about the importance of virtual residencies, 23% of providers said that they were preparing for virtual residencies. 6% reported having internet issues as an obstacle for their ability to undertake virtual residencies, and 50% said that they were not interested in virtual exchange. Digital access issues came through in the survey. Some artists indicated that virtual experiences had allowed them to make valuable connections that would otherwise not have been possible, while some respondents indicated that much would be lost through replacing an in-person residency experience with a digital one. The survey highlighted the financial precarity and geographic inequalities existent within the field. One respondent commented that it has driven home the precarity of artists' livelihoods and how wider inequalities are both reflected and perpetuated in the makeup of our sector, and made me consider why we choose to work in the arts, what kind of art world we want to see, how we can better support artists in need, what an art practice can or needs to look like, and what kind of future is out there for artists. So we're currently in the process of developing Survey 3. If you have suggestions or questions that you think should be included, please email us. We hope to focus on post-COVID recovery, organisation plans for recovery, learn of permanent changes to residency programs and decipher how these have affected the sector, gather artists' attitudes in relation to international travel and residency participation, develop concrete plans to assist our members, encourage artists and arts residency sector to examine access issues that have been highlighted by the pandemic and work towards a future where residencies are more accessible, gain input from arts funding bodies and broaden the arts disciplines that we've represented. We are interested in focusing on the global cost of living crisis and gathering data on mental health impacts and working conditions for providers. We're in the process currently at Res Artis of strategic planning and wish to incorporate all our findings into our plan for the next few years and beyond. So in the words of a survey respondent and echoing Res Artis aims, I feel more committed to the arts sector than ever before because I believe arts and creation are the way forward in putting together a broken world and having visions of a possible future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. There's a lot of information, obviously, in these reports. A lot of work has gone into producing both of them. So we'll point out that on AN's website and also on Res Artis' website, these reports are all freely downloadable and would urge you to have a read because, as you can see, they're quite dense, but actually incredibly insightful. One of the things that strikes me particularly about this, and obviously with the conference and how we are working together, is this Venn diagram, which is this cross-section of artists as art workers, because quite a few are, and then artists, residency providers. So many residency organizations are staffed by artists, or they are what we would call micro-organizations, and there seems to be that double time around putting that labor in, both in terms of that artistic practice, but in terms of then that project management of being a residency provider. So I'm really interested in the way that those two things connect together. Also, I think it's worthwhile just mentioning, which I think is quite extraordinary, certainly for the Res Artis membership. As many people know, until last year I was on the board as president of Res Artis, and I'm on the steering committee for the surveys. And one thing that wasn't in all of those statistics, but I think is an absolute testament to the membership organizations of Res Artis, is during Survey 1 in 2020 and that Survey 2 period in 2021, there were only a handful of incidents in terms of discussions between artists and residencies that were forwarded to Res Artis to assist with conflict resolution. So overarchingly, the Res Artis member organizations and artists, when going through one of the most turbulent international residency and artist mobility times that we've ever faced, were able to come to, through transparency, communication, contractual arrangements, were able to come to agreements without coming back and needing a third-party mediation. And those ones that we did do, just to put that in absolute perspective, given the number of membership organizations that Res Artis has, in 2020, there were 6 mediations. In 2021, there were 4. And so I think that's an extraordinary testament to the values and the commitment to equality and transparency of the membership of Res Artis. So I wanted to mention that to everybody here. Notwithstanding that, I feel that residency organisations and providers and artists seem to be hierarchically down on the ladder and quite closely fit together. So what I'd like to ask our Julie and Josephine here is, looking at that collaboration, what suggestions, what they think actually the single largest challenge for their constituents, so for artists or for residency providers, is facing them now in relation to having a relationship with the other party.
I'm happy to go first. Well, firstly, I don't think we can say that what's the greatest challenge, because there are so many, and I don't think I could pick one. Obviously, I can speak to the both artist and residency provider side of things, and often we all know that funding is the biggest challenge, and I'm sure you'd be better placed to speak to that, Julie. But in terms of, have a few notes on both artists and providers, and I'll start with artists, and I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I have a captive audience of residency providers listening to me, and talk about the mental health impacts of residencies. And this isn't, again, the greatest issue, it's just one facing artists. And obviously these mental health impacts are made greater by mobility issues, visa issues, socio-economic issues that so many of the panelists have touched on so beautifully throughout the last 2 days. But I want to talk about just the mental health impacts of actually undertaking a residency. And while we agree that residencies are amazing transformational opportunities, and that's why we're all here, they can also be really daunting and stressful for artists. And often the stress can be exacerbated when there's not good communication between residencies and providers, and when expectations aren't clearly set. So some things I think that need to be thought of to mitigate that stress is that communication, proper inductions before artists begin residencies, and clear expectations set by both sides, and check-ins with artists throughout the residencies. And not all artists will want to participate in those check-ins. They might or they might not, but it's important to offer that opportunity in case they need. And I think it's been very clearly established throughout the last few days that no artist will be the same with the same needs, just as no residency provider is the same. I also think it's important to assess what the desired outcomes that you're expecting of artists are. If you're asking for an exhibition opportunity and it's in a very short time frame, is that possible for the artist to produce work that quickly, or is that too stressful? Is it worth noting when you suggest that that's a desired outcome that they can show past work, because they might not be able to make new work within a 3-week residency? Likewise, with a lot of feedback from artists is that public programs that are set outcomes and expectations from residencies can be overwhelming. And that's not to say cancel public programs, because I love public programs, but let the artists help you shape what a public program is for them and what feels comfortable. And I think the other main issue facing artists is definitely access across the sector, physical access and digital access. And again, that comes back to communication with artists and providers and asking for what they need. And in regards to providers, I would say, so this response actually comes from our membership survey that we sent out at the end of last year. So actually talking on behalf of a lot of you. And the main issues that were suggested were the need for networks, and there was a great sense of loneliness that came out of reportings from the pandemic. So for Res Artis to mitigate that, we're hoping to set up a lot more regional meetings in the coming years, and meetings, thematic meetings, so that we can continue to see the conversations that have happened over the last few days happen. Also, it was really illustrated that a lot of residency providers are concerned in regards to climate. So Res Artis has been working as part of the Shift Eco Certificate collaboration with 15 like-minded organisations, and we're working towards eco-certification for our organisation in the aim that we can then pass on that information to our providers. And yeah, Lee, I can see you want to say something.
No, that's great. I think there's a lot there, so I think that's really quite interesting. I'd like to kind of bring that in with Julie, especially the recommendations that were put obviously from the report, but specifically to a residencies context. What comments you might have from representing your constituents or your members, what we should be looking at.
Yeah, thanks. And what I won't do is repeat some of the things that you've already said. But one of the things that I didn't say right at the beginning of this is I used to work in Australia, actually. I used to work at the Australia Council for the Arts, and I ran the international studio program there. So I do have some real first-hand experience of some of the things that you've just been talking about, those issues for artists. And I'd only been in Australia, I think, for maybe a couple of weeks, and I got an email from an artist who was on a residency in the UK. And the email, and of course I opened it at a very different time to when that artist had sent it to me. And I opened the email, and the email was about the internet not working in the apartment that he had been given. And my first reaction was, well, what, in my head was, what can I do about it? I'm on the other side of the world. But of course, digitally, all I did is I emailed the residency, because I actually knew the residency people, because I'd worked in the UK for all those years as well. And it got sorted out immediately, although there was, at the time, it was a better time frame. I think it was about 9 hours difference. So I do understand some of the issues that come up, both for artists, but also as an organisation that actually provided residencies and worked with a network of residency providers across the world. But putting my AN hat back on as well. Oh, and I forgot, I did do a couple of years on pépinières, and if anybody remembers pépinières, that was an EU program many years ago. So yeah, that was residencies across the EU. So putting my AN hat back on, I think, I've talked very briefly in my presentation about artists and really this endemic issue of low to no pay. So you're already at a disadvantage financially. And then one of the things that I think is quite a challenge as well for artists is often, and I'm not saying this is across the board, we often list residency opportunities on our jobs and ops listings at AN. And there are quite a few where you have to actually pay to be considered for that opportunity. Now, I can maybe look online today and think of, oh, perhaps I would like to apply for that job, or I would like to perhaps do this. All of them, I'm paid. I've already got a job. I don't have to pay to apply for another job. And I think that can be a really big barrier. And I absolutely get it that, you need to cover your administration costs. But, I do have further along, I've prepared some, answers in advance. I do have some solutions for some of that. But also when you get the opportunity, actually really having that support, but also thinking that in fulfilling your aims and your outcomes that you want from residencies, actually think about those costs back home. Because, again, if I'm going on holiday actually for 3 weeks. I feel really absolutely grateful and lucky that I can go on that holiday. I've still got to pay my rent and everything, well, mortgage back at the ranch. It doesn't just stop because I go on holiday, nor do costs stop if somebody goes on a residency. But in thinking about that, residencies are absolutely key for artistic development and exchange, but can be quite exclusionary by their very nature. And so what I was thinking about is and maybe it's been discussed over the last couple of days, is how can then a residency, or as a residency provider, how can you actually kind of change the gearing on it? And if you think about it, they are a core part of professional and artistic development. And just as a musician might need to rehearse, or an actor might need to rehearse, that actually, you know, residencies should be put into that, like, I guess, suite of things which are about artistic professional development. And so I think you can kind of, you know, you can change the gearing on that and make them like absolutely very important. And then that collectively makes a better case for where they sit in an artist's career. And in collectively making a better case, then perhaps you can make a better case for more funding that would help that person who actually can't afford to even apply for the residency because there's a fee, and then can't afford to take time out, or you know, not be able to pay for their rent or their other expenses back home when they move to this residency. And yes, so you know, I've done a lot of fundraising as well. So I do think, you know, making a collective case for additional funding, you know, is good, but I do know it's a challenge.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting. And I mean, I'm all about solutions and mitigations, so I would love to hear from both of you around what specific suggestions you've got for mitigating some of the challenges, and especially internationally, because of course we know every context is different, every country, every funding structure, every process that we go through in terms of where the residencies are, those are all unique to those locales, but there are some universals. So I'd love to hear Josephine and Julie about what's the solution?
I don't know if there's one set solution, but I think from speaking to our members, and also as some of you may or may not know, at Res Artis, Lee touched on it, we have a complaint process where artists or providers can submit complaints, and then one of our board members undertakes an investigation in sort of a mediation way to try to resolve things. So if we find at the end of that complaint that our member isn't aligning to our core values, they couldn't be a member anymore. Doesn't usually get to that stage, but it's an important way to keep artists safe and keep our members safe as well. So I think in regards to not getting to that complaint process, because no one really wants to be there, one important thing for providers to do is to, going back to that idea of good communication from the get-go with the artists, and clear communication is actually explaining what your organisation is and the capacity of your organisation, because as we've seen over the last few days, while some of our members are humongous institutions with lots of funding and lots of staff, many aren't. Many are artist run, many are resourced by volunteers, and they don't have great capacity. But because they're so good at the work that they do, they present beautifully online. When artists are applying for them, they look amazing. And it's important, I think, for providers to say to artists, it is only myself and someone else working voluntarily running this residency, so that those expectations of what is possible is actually set. I think it was Russell, in a talk yesterday, touched on artists understanding working on a shoestring, which is true, but sometimes artists don't understand that providers are also working on a shoestring. So I think talks about capacity really help with mitigating potential issues.
I think that's really important, that clarity, that transparency. Julie?
Yeah, and again, when I was thinking about this earlier this week, you know, I actually, you know, as I said, I have a real understanding of, you know, the small artist-run spaces that perhaps run residencies, up to the very big organisations. And one of the things I should have said actually in answer to the previous question as well is about providing. I think that's really important because it provides a range of different offers. And again, when I ran the international studio program in Australia, we had different offers. So we had offers that came with 3-bedroom apartments, so that they were obviously taken up by artists who had families. And so I think having that diversity within the membership is really great, but I'm thinking about how do you all support each other? And I'm wondering, and also perhaps again mitigate against artists even before they can apply for a residency might have a hurdle that they have to go through. And I was thinking, is there something around doing collective call outs, or larger organizations partnering artist run spaces, because then it actually gives those artists that maybe wouldn't necessarily be able to apply, perhaps having that pooling of resources would mean that there was more resource to actually give to an artist that in some ways would never be able to apply to do a residency. I know that when I left art school, of course I wanted to go and do a residency. Who didn't? And I did apply for some that were funded, but also I could absolutely not apply for anything that wasn't funded. I remember being extremely jealous of one of my fellow students who went off to an amazing residency in Cyprus and got all this painting done, and then came back, and she had to pay for it all, but of course, she had the means to pay for it. I had to come out of college, and luckily in those days we didn't have these humongous, debts, and just work. And so, there are these barriers that get put in place, and perhaps with collective call-outs and partnerships, you can kind of start to remove some of those barriers. And, I was thinking of them as well in terms of when I worked at Liverpool Biennial. I'm not actually even going to talk about the residency program at Liverpool Biennial, but we used to do, we did this strategic touring program. And I kind of wondered as well whether there is a lens that you could put on residency provision that was a little bit like a kind of touring model, where, a group of organizations come together and think about, those opportunities. Obviously, a mix of residencies, as I've said, is really important. And then also, as we've all found from the pandemic, you can, provide these hybrid solutions.
Great. And I think, we especially on that residency network conversation that we had earlier this week, there are a lot of really interesting and also sort of equitable models coming out. And I know Lena's in the audience who was talking from Raro about the way that they work with local artists and international artists. I think there's some great possibilities there. We are drawing very close to the end of our session, so I'll ask for perhaps one particular takeaway from either of you around looking at, given the huge upheaval that we've had socially, internationally over these last 3 years, and we know there's been a lot of challenges, but also we've arrived in a very different place. And I'm wondering actually if we've had any unexpected positives that have come out of this period, or something that we can take forward if we took forward one thing about making a positive collaboration or communication between artists and their residencies. So if I could have a kind of brief takeaway from each of you. Julie, maybe you go first.
I don't know whether it'll be that brief. I'll be as brief as possible. I mean, clearly the world collapsed in on itself, so we're able to connect digitally and use digital tools. And so artists, actually, in terms of their practice, they can be based in many different places in the world and still connect into, the different markets, the different opportunities across the world. So that digital, the world kind of folding in on itself. But the one thing I did want to say as well, as a little bit of a takeaway, is, perhaps as well, I would say to artists, somebody said to me once, I'd quite like to do the claw, but I'm not sure whether I'm ready for that yet, and etc. But perhaps I'll just create my own claw fellowship, you know, by thinking about a mentor and this and that. I thought, what a great idea. So, you know, for the artists out there, think about it. You can create your own residency.
It's a great idea. I agree that digital accessibility has brought a lot of benefits. We've seen artists from really remote locations who wouldn't be able to do an in-person residency elsewhere for a range of reasons be able to have that cross-cultural exchange online. I think it's also brought temporal needs to the fore. We've having to have those digital exchanges where a little bit better at understanding that time functions differently for different people. How time is used and functions for an artist in a remote location will be very different for how it functions in an urban centre. And likewise, as beautifully illustrated by Cheryl and Ali yesterday, time functions or may need to function differently for an artist who's disabled. And I think the process of everyone having to slow down through lockdowns allowed us to consider that a bit more, and also allowed us to be better at talking about capacity. We all have a slightly better vocabulary now to talk about capacity, and you might have noticed that in little things like people now will have in their email signatures that I only work part-time, so I can't reply to you in certain times, please expect a delay. Just little things like that that note that we're getting a little bit better about talking through capacity.
I think that's an absolutely important takeaway, and making sure that we then take that and pull that through to the opportunities that we offer, and that idea around trying to put a lid on that over delivery. So designing under delivery from the get-go, and designing go slow the way that we think about slow travel, and designing opportunities that actually are either, if we can make them outcome free, or if they have particular outcomes, that those are managed within the resources that we're able to facilitate, I think are incredibly important. I'd like to thank you both for joining us, for all of our audience here. We will be shortly going to a break. The doors at the end of the auditorium will open up, and you'll be guided to where you can get some refreshments going out that way. So just hold on for a second and you'll see people who will be able to help you there. Thank you very much.